Welcome, boys and girls and teachers and parents and everybody else, to this segment that we call the Native Americans of Maryland. You know, we contemplate that. Who were these people? Where did they come from? And how long were they in Maryland? We know a few things about them. We know their technology. It was based on stone, bone, wood, and fire right here in front of us. So there's a lot of things that we'd like to know about them. Their culture was pretty complex, and we know something of their languages. Matter of fact, some of you actually know Native American words, and these people spoke a language which was called Algonquin. At least we call it that. And many of those words mean something. How many of you have ever been across the Chesapeake Bay Bridge? If you know the word Chesapeake, that means Great Shellfish Bay. Or how about the animal that has a black mass that we find in these forests? What we call a raccoon, they call it the arracoonin. And that means the scratcher. Have you ever been to Ocean City and Assateague Island? Again, another Native American word that tells us things. It meant beyond the island. We don't really know what that means. But to get there, you would have had to cross many rivers on the Chesapeake Bay. And again, those place names harken back to this time from hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. One of those rivers was called the Choptank. And that is from a native word that we've sort of changed from Tesheptank, which meant stream that divides. So a lot of times their names that we think are names are actually phrases, really, that are descriptions and are descriptive of the area of where they were. Another river you would have had to go across was the Nanticoke, and that's from an Algonquin word called Nantigo. It meant shellfish eaters. I wonder what they ate. Clams, oysters, and all kinds of shellfish. So we're going to learn about their culture and who they were, how they got things done, and where they lived and what their villages were like. Let's get started on this program. Boys and girls and teachers and parents and everybody else, we've made it to the Barnatorium where we can learn a little bit about the culture of the Native Americans of Maryland right up here. They were really a different group. I know many of you are used to seeing Native Americans on television out west with teepees. Well, guess what? These people did not have teepees. They had completely different kinds of lodgings, and we'll see that after a bit. But I wanted to share with you some of the amazing things that these people were. Number one, their big chief, whoever would be in charge of a huge territory, well, they were called Werowance. That's quite an interesting word. And they had no written language, so pretty much I can spell it any way I want. Werowance. And that meant often that you were a man. Remember that symbol. But guess what? Especially you girls. Did you know that Native American female chiefs existed as well? And sure enough, that was recorded. And they were called a Werowance. I don't know if that's where we get the word squaw from. But certainly, you could be a paramount chief if you were a girl. That's pretty neat. And guess what? Here's another thing for you ladies. Guess where the Werowance, the man Werowance, where he got his authority from? Who was it passed down from? His mother or his father? Might surprise you. It was the mom. So he got to be Werowance through his mother's side of the family, because this type of culture was a matrilineal as opposed to patriarchs. It was a matriarch. It was a female-led society. So it's pretty neat. It's pretty different. So if you were the big chief in charge of this big village, your territory might be like all of the western shore on the Chesapeake Bay as opposed to the eastern shore. And within that territory, there would be many different types of villages and different groups, but they all paid allegiance to the Werewants. And guess what a lesser chief was called? A Tyak. How about that? A Tyak. And the Tyak would be in charge of his people in those villages. So there could be many Tyaks in different areas. Some of the names of some of the villages could be the Mattaponists, the Potomacs, the Mattaponi people. And they had different names. Often their names meant we the people or the real human beings is what those things often translated into being. And so a Tyak chief, just like the Werewants or the Werewansqua, would have advisors. They have a Weezo. That's another name. And if they needed to defend their village from a foreign power, you might say, from northern Indians, they needed a war captain. So a Cockaroos was a war captain. How about that? That's kind of a neat sounding name, isn't it? War captain. And the Weezo was a peace council. You know, instead of going to war, the ladies would get together with the men, and they would all listen to each other. They would sit in a circle rather than in a line. And when one person spoke, they valued oratory or speaking skills, and everybody would listen. They tried to come to consensus when they were making decisions, especially ones as serious as going to war. So really, it's fascinating. Now, there was good and bad. If you're in this village here, or let's say there's a village way over here on the fringe of the territory, the Werewants or the Werewansqua would actually send tax collectors out. Now, we don't think of, 400 plus years ago as having taxes in North America with Native Americans, but in a way they sort of did. So the Werewants or the Werewansqua would send their tax collectors to this village. And the amazing thing is that if these people heard that there were runners coming to their village, everybody would go crazy. This was written about in primary documents. That means Europeans wrote things down, and then we call those primary documents. And they found out that these tax collectors were coming, then the people in this village would go crazy. They would go and start grabbing things and burying them. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, it's something that we call, I'll spell it here, tribute. What's tribute? Well, you owe tribute to your werewants. So basically, tribute was whatever you were manufacturing or had. Let's say, for instance, you had 10 pumpkins. If you had 10 pumpkins, the tax collectors might come and take 8 parts in 10. So of your 10 pumpkins, they might take away 8 of your pumpkins that you've worked so hard to plant and to grow. If you had 10 deer skins, if you had 10 deer skins, they would take 8 of those. Now, why in the world would the werewants want all of these pumpkins and all of these things and strands of beads made from wampum, which are from clamshells and so forth? Well, if he was going to war with this village up here, he or she of the paramount chiefs might need fighting people. And so, if you take all these things that you collected called tribute, and then you redistribute them, you gain alliances. In other words, he would give gifts to Tyaks coming to visit him, say, hey, we need some fighting men. Maybe you can give us a hand. Oh, by the way, here's some buckskin skins for you to take with you. Here's extra food, you see. So these people were really sophisticated. They were more like kings and queens to the Europeans, to the point where they even called, instead of a werewants or a werewansqua, they called them emperors. How about that? So I think we need to go back in time next and see what we can see as it relates to this culture.
The Native Americans of Maryland lived on either side of the Chesapeake Bay. The Piscataway people lived in southern Maryland, and they were also known as the Kanoi by their enemies to the north. On the eastern shore, the Nanacoke Nation existed. These people were still in the Stone Age when Captain John Smith sailed up the bay. Their technology was based on stone, bone, wood, and fire. But they were some of the world's greatest naturalists known. Every plant and tree and bush had significance to the Native Americans, whether it provided them with medicine or food or tools. But they were intimately aware of their landscape, and it was very important to them. Their homes, called witchots, were part of the landscape as well, either made of mats or bark-covered dwellings. Witchots were very, very warm, according to Smith, as he entered some of them. He said they are warm as toast, but very smoky. And that's because Native Americans built their fire, their hearth, if you will, right on the dirt floor. And the smoke had to exit via holes in the ceiling or right through the thatch itself. Most of the time, Native people were living outdoors. But the witchot could be like an apartment house for Native Americans. There could be several families living in one of these at different hearths on the inside. They could be 30 feet or more long. By the time Smith arrives, Native American populations had been on the rise. And Smith noted that they had built palisades around their villages. We might call it a fort. That's a lot of work. But Native Americans were at warfare with each other because of the pressures of population and other factors. So they built these. You can see them dancing around a fire, and you can see the shape of many of their other dwellings. Native American men were quite able to shoot deer on the run. These people were hunters, they were gatherers, and they were also farmers. And the bow and the arrow during the late woodland period is their principal weapon. Men went nowhere without their bow and arrow. And you can see one of their other tools in their toolkit behind the other two hunters. It's fire, used to drive the animals. Gathering things, Native people knew where and when things were growing. It's like knowing where the frozen food section is in Wegmans or traveling to the baked goods in a store. If you don't know where those things are, you'll have a hard time finding them. And Native Americans' food and their nutrition was based on seasonal movement around the landscape. However, they were great farmers. At this point in time, they were growing the Three Sisters crops. And these Three Sisters were planted in mounds in burned out sections of forests. It's called slash and burn agriculture. If you were a boy, a girl, or a woman, a lot of your work would be spent in the garden helping to maintain it and keep down the weeds. Or you might find yourself up in that treehouse. And basically, that person is a living scarecrow. It was their job to shout, make noise, and throw rocks any animals trying to come into the garden to eat. And here are the Three Sisters: corn, beans, and squash. Pumpkins are squash, and you can see the bean right in the middle, the bean pod, and you can, of course, see the corn. This was their most important food crops. Native women did the harvest. As a matter of fact, they factored their year into 5 seasons, whereas we think of our calendar year as having 4. But theirs was based on the seasonal things happening around them. They had the budding of spring when buds popped out onto the trees, the earing of corn when corn began to grow in their gardens and the ears of corn began to appear, the falling of leaf when the leaves began to change color, and the cohonk season when the geese returned, or the moon of the highest sun during the height of summer. Native people didn't need a written calendar. All around them told them what time of year it was. And the crops they grew were quite varied. They would grow a dozen different types of corn and many different varieties of squashes and pumpkins, which is really smart, because if you don't do that and you have insect pests build up, they might attack and destroy your whole crop. But by having many different varieties, This ensured that no one crop would be completely destroyed. They even had pumpkin varieties that would keep fresh when they buried them in the ground, so that they could have squash in the middle of winter and it would taste just like it did in summer. Men and women participated in cooking. Women were highly skilled at making clay pots that could hold several gallons. Here's a group cooking succotash, which means a mix or a mixture. And succotash could have turtle meat or raccoons, and one of the favorites, and we know this from the bones found in their trash sites, passenger pigeons, all boiled together. Then they might sit down for a feast together. This is an ancient drawing, and it shows you the clothing that these people wore. Buckskin clothing. This man has a mohawk. The woman is wearing pearls around her neck, we assume, or beads at the very least, and you can see the foods they were eating. Corn, fish, nuts, and the thing that looks like a squid is actually a buckskin bag, probably holding the one crop men did grow, their sacred upawuk. We call upawuk today tobacco, and you can see his pipe under his knee. Men did hunting and warfare and trading and traveling, but they also did the heavy work of clearing for new fields. If the women came to them and said, we need to open up a new section of forest, that's what they would do. And they used the technology available to them: stone, bone, wood, and fire. And here they're using stone axes and fire to kill the trees, where they will then plant their crops amongst them. This man is removing bark. This person is hollowing out a log. I wonder what they would be making with a hollowed log. The dugout canoe. This is what the Native Americans of Maryland used on the Chesapeake Bay. They traveled. Here in the early spring, Native Americans knew that it was time to build a weir. And this was basically just a branch fence in the middle of a stream, which would have one entryway. Some of our streams in the area still bear the names of why Native Americans used the weir in the stream. This one's called Herring Run, because in February and March, when food was at their lowest, Native Americans built these weirs in the stream to capture fish. Here's a fish trap placed in the middle. That's really, really smart. Think about it. A Native American family could be sound asleep in their witch hut. Meanwhile, their trap is catching fish. And they don't even have to bait it, because the fish can only go through the one area, and that is where the opening is, and that is where the trap sits. These people were masters of knowing how to get food. Using dugout canoes, nets, spears, they could capture fish. And you can see a large weir behind the men with the spears. I'll bet you know what this animal is. Well, they had a wide assortment of animals that they could use for food in Maryland. There were deer like these, there were elk, there were bear, many other animals that Native Americans would get together during the hunting moon in October, and they would kill as many animals as they could. They would build large circles of fire, which would frighten the animals towards the middle, where waiting hunters with spears and with bows and arrows would wait. And that's important, because it would take at least 4 deer to provide clothing for one person. That's a lot of animals. If you had a village of, say, 100 people, you'd need 400 deer just for one set of clothing. But once the skins were had, then Native Americans would proceed in preparing them to be turned into leather or buckskin. They would use stone tools to remove the hair, and then they even used the brains of the animal. They wasted very little, which would be rubbed into the skins, and then the skins would be pulled and stretched until they were dry. They were then smoked over a fire, which turned them a buckskin brown, and then they were ready to be made into clothes. Many parts of the deer were used and were useful. Right here is a tendon coming from the leg bone of a deer, using a stone flake to remove it. If you take that tendon and dry it, and then pound it with wood on wood, it starts to separate up into its basic fiber, which we call sinew. And sinew was used with glue made from the skin of the deer to make composite tools and weapons. Here's an arrow head of stone being applied to that arrow shaft. And sinew and hide glue is very strong once it dries. It's almost like an organic fiberglass and resin, but it's organic, of course. Even the bones of deer were an important resource for Native Americans, because with bone they could make many different kinds of tools. You could make fish hooks, you could make arrowheads from antlers, you could make needles and knives and awls that allow you to sew. Even putting bones together, you can create animal calls to attract animals within range of the bow and the arrow. So bones were very important to Native Americans. With them, they could sew their center seam moccasins.
The Native Americans of Maryland were some of the best naturalists that the world has ever seen. I mean, they were intimately in tune with their environment. And what's more, they were able to live on this landscape for thousands of years without using it up or degrading it. So I have a great deal of respect for these people. Let's go and take a look at how Native Americans use plants for medicine and food and tools. So, in order to make fire, we know that Captain Smith talks a little bit about them rubbing sticks together. We don't know exactly what technique they were doing, but I'm going to use a friction fire bow and drill. So you need a bow, and I use hickory. So there's a way. That's a flexible but a strong wood. I'm using a piece of tulip tree right here, and my fire drill end of this thing is actually a piece of yucca plant. So this was the actual stalk of the flower at one point. You also need other flammable materials. So this is material that we'll take a look at, but it's composed of, throughout this segment, it has red cedar bark or juniper in it. It has river birch, and it also has shredded basswood. And those are plants that are found right in the area, especially here in Maryland. The last thing I do need, though, is a piece of rock that has a belly button, and that's for fitting the fire drill against, and you'll see that. My preferred hearth board is juniper. So let's give it a try. We need a temperature of about 800 degrees, so that's what this drill is going to do, we hope. Basically, the wood gets pulverized against the hearth board, and then as we keep the energy going with this bow, it generates hot gases that of course are invisible, but they would ignite a dust that's formed from the pulverized wood. It's coming out of one of these notches, and I'm going to watch to see if there are coal forms. We're not going to get flame. We need a coal. I think we have it. We're going to look for the baby fire, and he has a red eye. And I'm tapping this gently so that my coal doesn't fall out. And that smoke you see rising is from that. Baby fire be born. When you see his red eye, we'll know he's alive. Come on, baby fire. Oh, do you see his red eye blinking at us? Look at that. That's awesome. Then we need a nest. Here's our fire nest. You want to pick this up carefully and place it right in there. So as far as we know, this is how native people would have made fire. Now I'm going to push this against it and blow into it. Look at that. This is humidity. There it is. And we put it right in to the fire. How about that? We'll put our nest in there. And let's let it catch. I've used wood from another bush-like tree in the area called the spice bush because it has a lot of oils in it which are flammable, just like this birch bark has. Look at that. And that's how we begin the fire, so that we can cook. The Native Americans grew a wide range of foods that they took advantage of. And as we said earlier, their subsistence strategy was based on seasonal movement. But they were also farmers, and they grew crops that we will recognize today, and they gathered from the land. They would cook on flat rocks, like this fire over here, and of course they were famous for their pottery, cooking by putting rocks around that. And then over here, we have the way they would broil their fish. They would build these barbecue sets that are made out of green wood, which allowed them to cook because, that's hot. That's a fish cooking right there from the radiant heat coming up. And because the wood is green, it doesn't burn very easily. So let's take a look at some of the things that they would gather from the land. Of course, the three sisters that is famous the world over is corn, beans, and squash. As we can see here, Native American corn was many different colors. It was quite beautiful, and they grew many different varieties of this, which was really smart. Here's your squash, and here's your beans. So that's your famous three sisters. Look at these beans. Beans, corn, squash. They called it mahiz or maize. But they also grew, I don't know if you knew this, sunflowers. Look at these sunflower seeds. So they could eat them just like we eat them. They could extract their oil from them as well. And this one you might not recognize, not in flower yet, but this is another kind of sunflower. And it's called we call it today the Jerusalem artichoke. We don't know what they called it. But if looking here, we can see some of the foods they could grow and gather. And these are the wild tubers of the Jerusalem artichoke. This is the largest fruit in North America. So when they were traveling around with their subsistence strategies, they were going to places where the pawpaw was growing. Look at that. Wow. That's our biggest fruit in North America. Tastes like banana and pear mixed together. Processing your corn, native people used a mortar and the pestle, basically a burned out log inside, and this hickory. So you take the kernels off of the corn. There we go. Just like that. They go into our mortar, and then we begin by pounding it. Let's see how we did. There you go. That's cornmeal. This could be then mixed with water, bear's grease, dried berries, and then you cook it on a flat rock right here. And so you get these, what we call them Johnny cakes. They called it no cake. And they would take a bag of cornmeal with them, and they could cook, or they would make a large number of these right off the rock. That's pretty good cornbread. It's basically unleavened. That means it hasn't risen. Cornbread. That's a corn cake going. Now, native people grew many different varieties of pumpkins, and that's really smart. That's really genius. And the reason we think is because no one particular pest could attack one of your varieties of pumpkins and wreck all of your pumpkins if you have different varieties, because certain pests will go after certain varieties and be a problem. So they were really, really smart people. They grew squashes, essentially, which is what a gourd is. That's what this is. So that they could make containers, bowls, and spoons out of that. And they gathered from the wild. Besides pawpaws and other things, here are nuts that we've collected. This is black walnuts and chestnuts. How would you open them? Well, we found nutting stones where they would use a rock against another one, so it was kind of an anvil stone. There's the nut meat, rich in fats and oils and protein. So nuts were an important source of nourishment for them. Men had one special crop that they also grew, and I have it here in this little pouch. Just wanted to share with you. This was used in conjunction with this little tool. And we put it in there just like that. And then they would get themselves a hot coal and what was that plant? They called it upawuk. We call it tobacco. And tobacco was a sacred plant because its smoke carried your prayers upward to the Creator. And it would be shared with a traveler who would come to your camp. It was used to thank an animal for whose life you'd taken. So today, people abuse tobacco, but then it was a sacred and important crop to Native Americans. So, boys and girls, plants to Native Americans were very important. Not only were they good for food, but the wild plants around them provided them with fibers. And if you think about it, fibers are one of the most important things that we use as human beings even today. Think about it. Your shirt is made out of fibers. Yeah? They're all woven if you look at it carefully. Your pants, everything. So fibers were really important to Native Americans as well. And they used them in a lot of different ways that may be surprising to you. But let's take a look at some of the ways in which they used plant fibers. So you may wonder, where did they get fibers? Where did they get these materials from? Well, it's from the plants around them. Some of them are trees. As an example, here's a piece of tulip tree. And look how this is where you can get fiber from a tree, just by peeling it down the side of the branch. And so these are the fibers that they would be working with, as an example. You can pound these and they'll separate out. This is the outer bark. We really don't want that. That's what we're looking for, just this inner fiber material. Sometimes they even rotted the bark. Yeah, they actually sat it in water and let it rot a little bit. And so they would end up with some pure fiber. Let's take a look here. As an example, here's another type of tree. This was the tulip tree. This is basswood. And this was rotted off. And look, see how clean the fiber came out right there and here. And so basically making cordage or string is a matter of just wrapping these things around each other. I'm going to put this down over here. So I twist, just concentrate on that. And you'll see string invent itself in a second. Hang on. There you go. That's just basically the technique is twist towards you, and then twist away from you. And look at that. Look at the rope beginning to form right there. So really, your pants, your shirts, your undershirts, anything, cloth, your tea towels, everything is made of basically interlocking fibers, just like that. This goes back tens of thousands of years. It's an amazing thing. The plants that Native people used were just amazing in their diversity and how many could be found all around them. And they knew a great deal more than what I'm even telling you now. So let's move on. You know, Native Americans had a technology just like you and I have a technology. It's based on electricity and so forth. But for them, theirs was, well, it was stone, bone, wood and fire. And with that technology, they were able to live on this land, on this earth, for thousands of years without degrading it. That to me is the most remarkable thing. So we're going to see how some of these things possibly were made in this segment. So bone was really an important resource for Native Americans, and they made a variety of tools from it. Everything from needles to awls, using, and this is a harpoon head from leg bone of deer. And they used elk, even calls to call in animals, like this turkey call. So those things are pretty ingenious. And what did they do? Well, they would split and slivers of bone like this, and then find a nice grinding stone. Maybe add a little sand to it as well, and add water as needed to get rid of any bone dust on there. And by grinding this thing and keeping it up, it takes time. They would eventually shape this thing to get it to a sharp point. And awls like this are really important. You know, you can sew a pair of moccasins with just an awl and some leather. It's amazing. So these tools were very important to Native American culture. They used bone quite often. Native people used stone as well. The sharp edge is what helped people master their environment, and Native Americans were the same way. I mean, if you think about it, we're not very strong. We don't have big sharp teeth. We don't have giant claws like a bear. So humans had to come up with sharp edges, and by doing that, they found that stone broke and created those sharp edges. So one way to do that, we need to, if we're going to make an arrowhead or a knife blade, what have you, we need to get into this rock. So now that we've got this anvil stone situated, let's strike on top of this piece of quartz, see if we can't get some pieces out of it. Oh, we already did get a couple. Ooh, there you go. Ooh, there, that, boys and girls, might be the ticket. That's glassy. It's pretty even thickness, nice and wide. And we also have a few other options over on this side. And we still have that main core. So let's take them over to a work area and see what we can make. So we've come to our tool station, and like Native Americans, they probably had areas that they would have set up to work stone. Now we went from that big heavy anvil stone, but we have to downsize when we're working the stone slabs that we split off. Here they are in my hand. So we'll need a piece of leather that would protect our hand, and Native people use pressure flakers. So the first thing we did was a percussion with the hammerstone, and we'll probably shift over to these batons, which are made from the antlers off of a deer. And then we'll go down to the pointy things on the antlers called tines. They even had, in limited cases, copper pressure flakers in certain parts of the country. So we're going to give it a try. I'm going to start with that piece that I thought was really good to begin with. I'm going to start with a small, and what we want to do is try to work a small projectile point out of this. And, you know, now there you go. See, that's where things can happen. It looked like a good piece, but you never know how that's going to work out. So I'm going to shift over to another piece that we got from that same stone, and we'll see if we can work something out of it. And just so everybody realizes that we say that there's an arrowhead, and it might be a whole pile of projectile points. You know, we know that these triangular things were arrowheads here in the East, whereas this would have been a knife blade, or a spear point, or a slicer dicer, a ginzu knife. In either case, true arrowheads in the East are these little triangles, not a big spear blade, just so you know. The flakes come off from the bottom, which is why you see my finger lift up every now and again, so I can see what's going on. I can actually feel what it's doing, and you can get cut that way as well when those flakes come off the bottom, if you're holding your fingers in the wrong place. This is a white quartz, which is very common in Maryland, found in the Piedmont, which is where We are at the moment. You see those flakes? They just are crumbling off the bottom. And shortly I'm going to have to switch to a pressure flaker. I'm almost should be doing that very soon so I don't lose this whole thing. Because you never know. That's the bad news with quartz. The good news is there's a few billion tons of it. So we always have something to work with, no matter what. That was just me grinding the edge. We call it the platform. We don't know what native people called it. It's likely they had their own terminology for what we're doing now, but sadly, that part of it is lost to us. So I'm going to switch over to a pressure flaker. See if I can't get this thing into a proper shape. And now we're using this antler as a pressure flaker. And what I'm literally, instead of striking it, I'm going to actually press flakes from the edge off. You'll hear them break. You'll hear like a little, there you go. And the flakes still come off from the bottom. Now projectile points, we don't know what they would have called them per se. We have the names of projectile points to this day, but it's from our culture today, and it's usually their name for the person who found it or the locality of where they were found. Almost done. Just got a little bit on the bottom. That would be ready to go into production of arrow. Kind of hard to see the edges because the stone is so white. Makes it difficult to see for me as well as for you on camera. Oh, there we go. All right, that's not a bad point. They call these things a lavana. So if you're wondering how something like this would go on something like an arrow, I wanted to show you. And so again, these things are named for people who found them or where they were found. Like this one, you'll note, see how it's much pointier. It's like an isosceles triangle, and it was called a Hamilton incurvate, this guy right here. But look how it's glued on there. You see how sinew and pine resin glue attach it to the shaft, and that's how this one would be attached. It'd be more like this. Here's another lavana, but one made out of flint. So, you know, we looked at cutting tools like the arrowheads and how sharp that they can be, and I had to use pressure flakers and antler batons to break them. Native people also needed tools that were good for working wood, and they would use a different kind of stone. You know, the quartzes, the flints, the cherts, and all those other things weren't the best thing that they needed. So they were looking for these greenish, grayish stones that have already been shaped a bit. We call these today a celt. Native people, we see the name written as Tamahak, Tamahukan, and whatnot. So we had to use different tools. I can't really effectively use these batons on these, but what I can use is this big old piece of chert, and all these little edges here that get exposed from pounding are like little tiny stone chisels. We don't know if native people did this, but we have found, and these are recreated things, we found their tools, and you can see these little micro hits all over the stone, little peck marks. And here's what I mean by that. And this is how you would shape this kind of a stone, preliminarily. You just let this guy do the work. And actually some of that dust, see the stone dust on there if you home in, as that rock crumbles away. So that eventually we want to get this where we can grind this. So let's peck this a little bit more, and then we'll go right to grinding, and we'll show you what they would do. Might be time to grind it. So we got it pecked down. Now we take it to this slab of stone, and we're going to create a cutting edge. So this is what we think they were doing in order to polish the edge. And look at that. Now there's a cutting edge now. Native people would, they could even use on a piece of wood that was green, you could use a bone chisel and actually chisel a hole out of this. We call this the haft. We don't know what they would have called this, but this whole thing together, you put the stone in there like that, is called a, we call it a celt. We know that these were written and called tamahak or tamahuckin. We don't really know what that means other than the thing that we used to chop was, here's a piece of wood. Will it work? Let's find out. Well, I'll be doggone. Look at that. Yeah, I mean, what else? You know, native people were really smart. They didn't have trained beavers to do the cutting down the trees, so they came up with tools that would do the job. And without this, tamahak or tamahuckin, think of all the things they couldn't make. Couldn't make their homes. They couldn't cut down trees for canoes. A whole lot of things. Pretty cool. It works. It may surprise you when we talk about the Native Americans of Maryland. Most people think the bow and the arrow are the universal weapons that Native Americans use. But it might surprise you to know that it was actually, this is the first tool, a spear and a spear thrower. Let's see how they were used. So what we're using is an atlatl. At least that's how we say it today, or atl. It's A-T-L. Nobody really knows how it should be spelled. But basically, this is an extension of your arm, and it's a lever. So this stores energy, and it acts upon the spear in that way. And with this simple tool, not just Native Americans, but everybody throughout the world, during the Ice Age anyway, we think we're using some form of the atlatl. It increases your power of your throw, like 25%. So, you know, they were able to take big game with this, you know, horses, mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, you name it. So it's a really, was an important tool for all of humanity, but definitely the Native Americans of Maryland. So the Native Americans in Maryland, their bows were like 5.5 feet long or so, and one of the preferred woods was hickory. And what's interesting about these woodland Indian bows is that they're widest where you hold them, but that doesn't make any difference to the arrow which bends around them. Captain Smith said that their arrows were an L in length, and an L in the 17th century was about a yard or so. So they actually had pretty long arrows. They weren't as long as rainforest arrows that we've seen in the past, but these are about right, and their fletch, that is the feathers, are Canada goose feathers, and sinew is holding them in place and reinforcing the knock of them. They used a wide range of feathers. It might surprise you to know that their projectile points could have been out of antler points, okay, or wood. They used a lot of wood, which makes sense in a setting like this, to shoot. Their strings would either be made out of some very strong cord, like dog bane fibers twisted together, But what we do know for sure is they would take one strip of deer skin from the top of the deer's head, obviously the deer's dead, all the way down about 1 inch wide, and then they would twist this rawhide and let it dry like that. So their strings were often made from one strip of deer skin, which worked pretty well as long as it wasn't too humid or raining on them. So these are the weapons of choice that native people used. The bow and arrow, we think native people had about 2,000 years ago, all the way up to the time when Smith arrives. So it might be interesting to note that our European ancestors had the bow and arrow way before Native Americans perhaps invented their own. That's kind of interesting. You know, I think of tools and I think of weapons and other things that Native Americans use as a toolkit or a toolbox. And they had many different types of tools or weapons in order to get food. After all, well, if your parents have a toolbox, is it just filled with hammers? Is it only filled with screwdrivers? Of course it isn't. So they had a wide variety of things to work with. Well, this is some of the basic ones. And you know what these are? They are like little clubs, or like a non-returning boomerang. And these we call rabbit sticks. We don't know what they were calling them, but it's likely that the Piscataway and other groups had some of these basic tools. When they were in their gardens, if you had to defend your garden from rabbits and possums and other animals, especially women might carry some of these with them in order to get the small game. So we'll show you. Now I could throw a rock at the animal, but a rock is only yay big. So when you throw one of these, you can throw it overhand, you can throw it sideways. And when you throw it sideways, this thing is spinning in the air. See that? And it's covering a 3-foot arc. And you have a bigger chance of getting your game with it. Let's give it a try. You might be wondering what this thing is. This looks like a piece of bamboo. It is not. It's what we call river cane. And river cane was used extensively by Eastern Indians for making a blowguns, which is what this is. And now, there's no specific mention of blowguns via Powhatan or Piscataway and whatnot, but we know that blowgun was found all up and down the East Coast. Some people think that perhaps the early colonists just ignored things like this, but we know that for sure the Cherokee, Catawba people in the Southeast had them. Their weapons of choice was a tree that grows in the area. It's called black locust. It has a very hard wood, and they also employed the use of a flower. And what you're looking at, it looks like a primitive Q-tip. It's not. It is a material called thistle, and it's spun onto this piece of wood. So these are like little arrows that could be used. They weren't used for big game, but I've spoken to Onondaga people who are farther north, and they said that their people were using these to shoot passenger pigeons high up in the trees. This is the perfect weapon to do that. All right, let's see how they work. So at the end of our presentation today, we were learning about the Native Americans of Maryland. And I just wanted to point out some history is that when Captain Smith sails up the Chesapeake Bay in 1607, and he encounters native people in Virginia and Maryland. Within 90 years of his visitation, 90 years after, at the beginning of the 18th century, sadly, only a few dozen of Powhatans and Piscataway people lived any longer. And the reason is, many reasons really, but part of it is diseases that they had no immunity against, alcoholism, warfare, many things contributed to the fact that their culture, crumbled. But I also would like to point out that Native Americans in Maryland still exist. There are many people, especially in Dorchester County on the eastern shore of Maryland, who count their ancestry among the Nanticoke Indians. So just keep in mind that what we did today are activities and things that people had to do on a daily basis, making fire, using weapons, using tools, in order to make a living, you might say, off the earth without destroying it. I think that's the best part of that. So we hope you enjoyed this segment.